The fluorescent hum of the office lights had always been a steady companion, a mechanical pulse in the otherwise flat rhythm of Reid's days. His work, sifting through municipal zoning records, demanded a particular kind of patience, a determination to find the needle in a haystack of regulations. He thrived on the quiet satisfaction of clarity, of bringing order to chaotic documents. He sat hunched over a desk scarred by generations of bureaucratic hands, the air thick with the smell of old paper and lukewarm coffee. Outside, the city offered its familiar drone, a distant, reassuring thrum. His life was precise, predictable, a carefully constructed edifice of routine. Then the letter arrived. Thick, cream-colored stationery, an unfamiliar wax seal bearing a crest he didn't recognize. It landed on his desk like an errant stone, disrupting the neat stacks of permits and blueprints. His fingers hesitated, tracing the raised impression of the seal, a gnarled tree, its roots twisting into something indistinct, almost serpentine. The return address was a law firm he'd never heard of, in a town too small to register on most maps. He tore it open with a sudden, uncharacteristic urgency. The solicitor's crisp prose laid out the facts. Reid was the sole inheritor of a property, a cabin, bequeathed by a distant relative, a great-aunt's cousin twice removed, a name that sparked no memory. The individual had passed suddenly, mysteriously, the letter stated, no further details provided. The cabin, it continued, was located deep within a forgotten forest, miles from the nearest paved road. Secluded was the word used, a polite euphemism for isolated. Reid reread the letter, the words blurring slightly at the edges. A cabin. An inheritance from someone he barely knew, whose existence had been a faint whisper in a forgotten family tree. He felt a prickle of unease, a fissure opening in the solid ground of his routine. He had no desire for inherited property, especially not one so remote. But a quiet, insistent curiosity began to gnaw at him, a determination to understand this unexpected twist in his carefully ordered life. Why him? Why now? The solicitor had included directions, hand-drawn on a faded map, marking the cabin with a small X. The location felt less like an address and more like a destination on a treasure hunt, or perhaps, a descent. He spent the next few days in a fog, his focus on zoning regulations replaced by mental images of ancient trees and forgotten roads. The mundane became alien. He packed a duffel bag, a few changes of clothes, a sturdy flashlight, and a compass, items utterly alien to his usual urban existence. The thought of stepping so far outside his comfort zone was both daunting and, in a strange, unsettling way, exhilarating. He felt compelled, drawn by an invisible thread. The drive was long, the landscape gradually shedding its urban skin. Highways gave way to state roads, which in turn narrowed into winding county lanes. The concrete retreated, replaced by fields of dry grass and then, finally, the encroaching shadows of a dense forest. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. He passed fewer and fewer cars, the silence in the cabin of his vehicle growing oppressive. Hours into the journey, the road sign for the border checkpoint appeared, a stark, metallic rectangle against the fading light. He slowed, his old sedan rattling slightly. The checkpoint itself was a desolate affair, a single, weather-beaten booth, a raised barrier arm, and a small, functional building constructed of corrugated metal, all overshadowed by the towering, ancient trees that pressed in from every side. A solitary border agent, a man with tired eyes and a thin mustache, emerged from the booth. He approached Reid's window slowly, his gaze sweeping over the car's interior, then settling on Reid's face. "Purpose of travel?" the agent asked, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. Reid felt a strange tightness in his chest. "Inheritance." The agent's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. He stared for a long moment, then slowly, deliberately, he leaned closer. "That's remote territory, son. Not many go out that way anymore. There are things out there. Things that don't like being disturbed." A shiver traced its way down Reid's spine. He met the agent's gaze, searching for a hint of jest, but found only a deep, unsettling seriousness. "What kind of things?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The agent straightened, his expression hardening, as if regretting his momentary lapse. "Just be careful," he said, his voice returning to its official drone. He retreated to the booth, and with a groan of old machinery, the barrier arm lifted. Reid drove forward, the words echoing in his mind. "Things that don't like being disturbed." The road beyond the checkpoint quickly deteriorated, becoming a gravel track, then little more than two muddy ruts winding into the deepening twilight. The trees closed in, their branches weaving a thick canopy that swallowed the last vestiges of daylight. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. He was no longer just going to a cabin, he was venturing into something unknown, something that felt as old and foreboding as the towering trees themselves. The journey had ceased to be a simple drive and had become an undeniable descent. "Just be," the agent's words had trailed off, leaving a hollow echo in Reid's mind that resonated long after he'd left the sterile confines of the official building. He'd pressed for more, but the man had simply shaken his head, a grim line set across his lips, and offered a terse, "That's all Reid can tell you." The unspoken implications, however, felt heavier than any explicit threat. The drive to the cabin was a slow descent into deepening wilderness. He passed a solitary border checkpoint, a weathered shack manned by a stoic, silent guard who barely glanced at Reid's identification before waving him through. Beyond that point, the world seemed to shed its modern skin, becoming a place of ancient trees and hushed, expectant air. He'd packed light, just enough to sustain himself for a week or two while he sorted through his relatives' affairs, but the weight of the agent's unfinished sentence seemed to settle beside him on the passenger seat, a silent, unwelcome companion. Finally, the cabin emerged from the dense foliage, a silhouette against the fading light. He killed the engine, and the sudden cessation of sound was jarring. The cabin stood before him, a monument to forgotten time, its presence both imposing and strangely vulnerable. He pushed open the heavy front door. It groaned, a lone, drawn-out complaint that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Inside, dust motes danced in the slivers of weak sunlight filtering through grimy windows. The air was stale, thick with the scent of aged wood and disuse. He told himself it was just an old house, neglected for too long. His relative had lived here, after all, and while the death had been sudden, it had been attributed to natural causes, hadn't it? Yet, the agent's words, "just be," gnawed at him. The cabin seemed to shift and groan around him. A floorboard creaked upstairs when he was certain he was alone on the ground floor. He paused, listening, but the sound didn't repeat. Old house, he thought, dismissing it, settling. Later, while attempting to clear a space in the small kitchen, he heard a distinct tap-tap-tap coming from the wall beside him. It sounded like knuckles against wood, rhythmic but faint. He spun around, his gaze sweeping the empty room. Nothing. He rationalized it as branches scraping against the exterior, or perhaps a small animal. But the sound had been too precise, too deliberate. He found himself constantly glancing over his shoulder, a prickle of unease steadily growing on the back of his neck. Each time he turned, there was nothing. Just the still, empty rooms, the lamplight casting lone, distorted figures. He attributed it to exhaustion. To his mind playing tricks in the unfamiliar, dim light. He was tired, unsettled by the journey and the lingering mystery surrounding his relative's death. Seeking distraction, he began to explore the cabin more thoroughly, hoping to find something that might shed light on his relative's life, or perhaps, death. In a small, cramped study off the main living area, filled with dusty tomes and forgotten trinkets, he ran his hand along a heavy wooden desk. His fingers brushed against something hidden beneath a stack of yellowed papers. It was a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth, clasped shut with a tarnished brass buckle. He unlatched it, the metal groaning softly. Inside, the pages were filled with elegant, looping script, faded with age. It was a journal, not his relative's, he realized quickly, but much older. The handwriting was different, the language archaic, hinting at an author from generations past. The first few entries were mundane, chronicling weather and harvests, but then the tone shifted. It calls to the blood. The pact must be honored, or the earth will claim its due. Reid's breath caught in his throat. He flipped a few pages, his eyes scanning for more. It twists the mind, steals the light. The sacrifice. Pact? The silence of the cabin, once a comforting blanket, had become a shroud. Reid stood motionless, the leather-bound journal heavy in his hands, its pages whispering of pacts and sacrifices. The creaking floorboards, the drafts that snaked through unseen gaps, the sudden shifts in temperature, all the easily dismissed quirks of an ancient structure now felt like deliberate, malevolent acts. He tried to rationalize it, to tell himself the isolation was getting to him, that the grim discovery of the journal had simply primed his mind for paranoia. But the smell that began to seep into the cabin, a cloying, metallic sweetness layered over damp earth, was undeniable. It wasn't the scent of decay, not exactly, but something far more primal, like freshly turned soil after a heavy rain, mixed with the tang of copper. It seemed to emanate from the very floorboards, rising through the gaps, clinging to the air like a veil. Then came the sounds. Not the familiar rustle of leaves against the window panes or the hoot of an owl. These were softer, internal. A faint scratching, like claws dragging across wood, coming from behind the sealed door in the study. He'd tried the handle repeatedly, found it locked, the wood swollen and unyielding. One evening, while he meticulously cleaned the dust from the mantelpiece, a small, ceramic bird figurine, a relic from his distant relative's life, simply toppled. It didn't slide, didn't roll, it lifted slightly, then pitched forward, shattering on the hearth. Reid watched, frozen, the shards glinting in the dim light. There had been no tremor, no vibration. It had simply moved. His breath hitched. This was not settling wood. This was not a draft. Sleep became a battlefield. His reflection in the window at night was sometimes not quite his own, a flicker of something gaunt, eyes too wide, before it snapped back to his familiar, increasingly strained face. The rationalizations crumbled, one by one, like dry leaves underfoot. He could no longer deny it. The cabin was alive with something, and it was reaching for him. He had to know. he wasn't a man to cower. Not yet. The nearest town with a proper library was a good 3-hour drive, and he knew he'd have to pass through the old border checkpoint that marked the unofficial edge of this forgotten territory. When he finally reached the border checkpoint, a ramshackle collection of sheds and a rusting boom barrier, a lone, gaunt-faced officer barely glanced at him, waving him through with a weary flick of the wrist. It was a brief, disorienting return to something resembling civilization, a stark contrast to the encroaching wilderness he'd left behind. The mundane interaction felt strangely alien after days of unsettling solitude. He spent the next 2 days immersed in dusty archives and flickering microfiche readers in the regional library. His search began broadly, the history of the region, the specific land parcel, then narrowed to his distant relative, and finally, to any mention of unusual events or local folklore. The initial results were sparse, frustratingly vague. Old property deeds confirmed the cabin's age, stretching back centuries, passed down through a convoluted lineage that eventually led to his relative. Then he found it. A series of faded newspaper clippings from the early 1900s, detailing a rash of disappearances in the isolated forest settlement where the cabin stood. Not just a few, but several families, vanishing without a trace, their homes left intact, meals half-eaten. The article spoke of unexplained phenomena and local superstitions run wild, before abruptly ceasing. Further digging led him to a collection of local historical pamphlets, filled with quaint tales and cautionary legends. It spoke of ancient beliefs, of a hungry earth and the price of prosperity. It described a primitive covenant, made long ago by the first settlers to ensure fertile land and bountiful harvests, a pact with something indigenous to the soil. The language was archaic, veiled in metaphor, but the underlying message was stark, an offering, a recurring payment, to keep the malevolent presence at bay. He found mentions of families, including one name that resonated with his own family tree, known for their unwavering prosperity despite living on the edge of the barren lands. But this prosperity, the pamphlet implied, came at a steep cost, maintained by adherence to the old ways. The text hinted at a lineage, a chosen line responsible for upholding the bargain. Reid's hands trembled as he stared at the words. A lineage of sacrifice. The phrase from his relative's journal clicked into place with horrifying precision. He was part of that lineage. The cabin wasn't just a house, it was a legacy, a burden, and a cage. He had inherited not just property, but a debt, a terrible obligation that was now demanding its due. They were demands. Reid's fingers traced the worn leather of the journal, the previous owner's elegant script a chilling counterpoint to the words themselves, pacts and sacrifices. He wasn't just in a house, he was inside a memory, a trap. He returned to the study, the room where he'd first found the journal. His gaze swept over the cluttered shelves, the dusty tomes, the heavy oak desk. There had to be more. The journal he held spoke of a lineage, of the keeper. Surely, the keeper would have left a more complete record, a final testament. He ran his hand along the spines of books, the rough texture of ancient paper, the faint scent of mildew and aged glue. Nothing seemed out of place, no obvious loose panels or hidden drawers. Above it, a large, ornate wooden mantelpiece was carved with intricate, almost disturbing, symbols that he hadn't paid much attention to before. Now, they seemed to writhe, their serpentine lines hinting at something ancient and primal. He pressed against the wood, feeling for a seam, a give. Nothing. He wasn't looking hard enough. He wasn't seeing what was right in front of him. He thought back to the journal, to a passage mentioning the true heart of the dwelling. He scanned the study again, his eyes narrowing. The room felt off. The fabric hung too flat, too perfect. He pulled at the edge of the nearest tapestry. It resisted, then peeled back with a soft, tearing sound, revealing not plaster or wood paneling, but a rough, unmortared stone wall. His heart gave a violent lurch. This was it. This was the hidden room. He fumbled for the edge of the tapestry, pulling it further aside. Behind it, a narrow, almost invisible seam in the stone wall became apparent, a cleverly disguised door. He pressed against it. It groaned, a low, drawn-out sound that vibrated through the floorboards, and then slowly, ponderously, swung inward. He reached for his phone, its flashlight beam cutting a stark path into the gloom. The hidden space was small. An alcove carved directly into the earth beneath the cabin. The walls were rough-hewn stone, the floor packed dirt. In the center sat a rough wooden chest, bound with rusted iron bands. The air was thick and still, tasting of ancient dust and something indefinably wrong. He approached the chest, each step crunching softly on the dirt. He found a latch, stiff and unwilling, but with a grunt, he forced it open. The lid creaked upwards, revealing its contents. Beside it lay a collection of loose papers, a small, heavy stone carved with a single, unblinking eye, and a dried, skeletal bird's claw. This was not merely a record, it was a testament to something unspeakable. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded but still legible. He began to read, his phone's beam illuminating the terrifying script. The entries were terse, almost frantic, detailing not just a pact, but a bond. A bond forged with the very earth beneath the cabin, with something ancient and territorial that predated the forest itself. The journal spoke of a lineage, of a family chosen to be keepers, to offer tribute to the entity that resided within the land. It described a ritual, performed generations ago, to appease a malevolent spirit, an entity that demanded sustenance, not of flesh, but of will, of life force. The previous owner, the relative who had died, had been the last keeper. And now, Reid was here. A specific entry caught his eye, describing a journey taken by an ancestor, a journey to a remote location to acquire a specific component for the ritual. Through the desolate pass, beyond the forgotten markers, past the silent sentinels of the border checkpoint, the ancestor had written, "Where the world thins and the veil grows sheer." The words painted a picture of a bleak, isolated place, a threshold not just between territories. Between realities, where the commitment to the pact was solidified. The implication was clear, the entity's influence wasn't confined to the cabin, it stretched, subtly, across the land, tied to a history of desperate bargains. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was the land, or an extension of it. The cabin was merely its anchor, its most potent manifestation. The sacrifices weren't just abstract offerings, they were a continued feeding, a slow, generational drain. His relative's sudden, mysterious death wasn't an accident. It was the final, desperate act of a dying keeper, or perhaps, the entity's claim. As he absorbed the horrifying truth, a low, guttural hum vibrated through the packed earth floor, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the ground itself. He wasn't just reading history, he was feeling it, becoming part of it. The cabin was alive, and it was watching him. He was no longer an heir, he was the next offering. He was trapped. Reid's fingers still traced the worn leather of the journal, the previous owner's elegant script a chilling counterpoint to the words themselves, pacts and sacrifices. He wasn't just in a house, he was in a memory, a forgotten promise. He slammed the journal shut. A thin plume of dust, disturbed from its resting place, hung in the air, catching the faint light from the window. The cabin groaned, a low, drawn-out sound that seemed to come from its very foundations, not merely shifting timber. Reid's gaze darted around the main room. He blinked, rubbing at his eyes, convinced it was merely fatigue, the strain of too many sleepless nights spent poring over cryptic notes. But the sensation persisted. The sturdy oak table in the center of the room, upon which the journal now rested, appeared to subtly undulate, its polished surface rippling like disturbed water. He reached out a hesitant hand, his fingers brushing against the solid wood. It was unyielding, firm. Yet, when he pulled his hand back, the visual distortion lingered, a ghostly afterimage of movement. He pushed himself to his feet, a sudden, desperate urge to flee seizing him. This wasn't just a dilapidated cabin, it was a hungry maw. The walls seemed to lean inward, the low ceiling pressing down. He stumbled towards the front door, his determination hardening into a desperate resolve. This place was twisting his mind, making him doubt his own senses. The latch, which had been stiff but operable moments before, now refused to budge. He twisted, pulled, pushed, grunting with effort. It was stuck fast, as if welded from the inside. He tried the back door, then the windows. Each one, previously functional, was now jammed, sealed, or inexplicably painted shut from years of neglect he hadn't noticed before. This wasn't rust or decay, it was deliberate. He was trapped. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards, rising from somewhere beneath the cabin. It wasn't an animal sound, it was too deep, too resonant, carrying an ancient, malevolent intelligence. He wouldn't let it consume him. He rushed to his old truck, parked haphazardly near the cabin. He threw the gear into reverse, gravel spitting from beneath the tires, and sped down the winding, overgrown track that led away from the cabin and deeper into the forgotten forest. The forest itself seemed different now. The ancient trees, once merely majestic, now loomed like skeletal sentinels, their branches reaching, grasping. He drove for what felt like hours, the track narrowing, the undergrowth scraping against the sides of the truck. He knew the way out, had driven it several times since arriving. But the landmarks blurred, the turns felt unfamiliar, and the relentless tunnel of trees offered no escape. Then, through a sudden break in the dense foliage, he saw it. An unexpected, anachronistic structure. A border checkpoint. It stood stark against the fading light, a squat, concrete blockhouse with a rusty boom barrier extending across the narrow track. There was no sign of life, no official, no light. It was derelict, forgotten, yet undeniably present. Reid slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just before the barrier. He knew this forest was remote, but a border checkpoint? Here? It made no sense. He had crossed no national or even state line. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel. He approached the barrier, a heavy, weathered metal pole. It was locked down, secured with a thick, corroded chain wrapped around a concrete pillar. He recoiled, spinning around, searching the empty forest. Nothing. Just the looming trees and the desolate checkpoint. Then, a flicker. On the pocked concrete wall of the blockhouse, a faint image began to coalesce, shimmering into existence like heat haze. It was the face from the old daguerreotype in the cabin, the distant relative, the one who had died. The image pulsed, growing clearer, more defined, until it seemed to be etched into the very stone. You cannot leave. The pact holds. One cannot break the circle. Reid stumbled back, his mind reeling. The cabin hadn't trapped him, the entire forest, this forgotten land, was part of it. The checkpoint wasn't a barrier to the outside world, it was a threshold, a declaration that he was already inside, irrevocably claimed. He was the next link in the chain, the next sacrifice. The face on the wall solidified, its eyes fixing on him with an ancient, knowing malevolence. It was the entity, using his relative's image as a cruel mask. He scrambled back into his truck, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely insert them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, a desperate sound. He slammed the truck into reverse, spinning it around, heedless of the rough terrain. Not because he wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go. The forest, the cabin, the terrifying presence, they were one, and he was caught within their grasp. The cabin wasn't just a living trap, it was a prison, and the bars extended far beyond its walls. Reid's hands trembled, but his grip on the steering wheel was resolute. The realization from the previous night, that the forest itself was a cage, had settled into a cold, hard knot in his gut. But acceptance was not an option. He was not a sacrificial lamb. He would fight. He would find a way out. He had started the engine an hour before dawn, the rumble of the old pickup a defiant roar against the oppressive silence of the woods. He hadn't bothered to pack much, just a satchel with essentials and the heavy, leather-bound journal he'd found tucked away in the cabin's attic. The gravel track leading away from the cabin was barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom, but he knew the way. Or thought he did. He pressed the accelerator, the tires spitting loose stones, and pushed past the last of the cabin's warding totems, those crude, twisted effigies he'd grown to despise. The forest immediately began its work. The trees, previously mere observers, now seemed to lean in, their ancient branches forming a gnarled tunnel. He slowed, squinting at the road ahead, the headlights cutting weak swaths through the swirling mist that had materialized from nowhere. It wasn't fog, it was too dense, too localized, like a living shroud. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the passenger side, startling him. A branch, thick as his arm, had snapped clean off an unseen tree and fallen across the path just feet ahead of him. He slammed on the brakes, the pickup skidding to a halt. His breath hitched. It felt less like an accident and more like a deliberate obstruction. He eased forward, navigating around the fresh timber, his eyes darting into the dense undergrowth. He pushed on, his determination warring with a rising tide of unease. The road twisted more sharply, veering off what he remembered as the correct route. He checked the compass on his dashboard, the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. His phone, which he'd tried repeatedly, remained a dead brick in his pocket. No signal. Of course. He drove for what felt like hours, the sun now a pale, distant smear above the canopy. The forest never changed, never thinned. It was an endless, repeating tableau of towering pines and skeletal hardwoods, each one identical to the last. He felt the insidious tendrils of disorientation begin to take hold. Had he driven in a circle? He shook his head, refusing to entertain the thought. He was moving forward. The border checkpoint. It stood exactly as he remembered it: two weathered wooden posts, a sagging crossbeam, and a rusted, chain-link gate pulled across the narrow track. Relief, sharp and painful, flooded him. He had made it. This was the edge, the boundary. He walked towards the gate, his boots crunching on the gravel. The chain link was old, but the padlock looked newer, heavier. He reached out to test it, his heart thudding against his ribs. It was solid. Unyielding. It was the left wooden post, the one he'd barely noticed on his hurried arrival. It was a token, carved from petrified wood, identical in shape and unsettling iconography to the one he had found hidden in the cabin's deepest drawer. The same swirling, almost organic symbol that seemed to shift and writhe at the edge of his vision. This wasn't just a boundary, it was a declaration. The entity hadn't just claimed the cabin, it had marked the very exit, planting its sigil, its ownership, where he thought he might find freedom. He stumbled back, his gaze fixed on the token. The checkpoint wasn't a barrier to the outside world, it was the final, inescapable threshold within its domain. He was meant to see this. He was meant to understand. The forest had not merely thwarted his escape, it had led him here, to this specific spot, to deliver a message. He backed away slowly, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees. The air vibrated with that unseen hum, pressing in on his eardrums. He could feel eyes on him, a pervasive, ancient awareness that permeated the very bark of the trees, the soil beneath his feet. His determination, so fierce moments ago, began to fracture. The futility of his efforts crashed down on him, a crushing weight. He wasn't just lost, he was contained. He was trapped, and the forest, this malevolent, living entity, had just shown him how utterly powerless he was. He wanted to run, but where? Every direction was the same. Every path led back. Reid's hands, though still trembling, gripped the steering wheel with a resolve that felt brittle, yet unbreakable. The previous night's chilling revelation, that the forest itself was a meticulously crafted cage, had solidified into a cold, dense knot in his gut. But acceptance was not an option. He was not a sacrificial lamb, waiting for the butcher's knife. He would fight. He would find a way out, even if every twisted branch and whispering shadow conspired against him. The path, barely more than a deer trail, had once been a logging road, he'd learned from a faded map in the cabin. Now, it was overgrown, the underbrush clawing at the vehicle's sides, the trees overhead forming a dense, suffocating canopy that permitted only slivers of bruised light. It was alive, and it watched him. Hours crawled by, each one stretching into an eternity. The gas gauge, stubbornly stuck at half, seemed to mock him, never dipping despite the miles he knew he'd covered. The sun, when he glimpsed it through the canopy, remained stubbornly high, as if time itself had snagged and stalled. Yet, he pushed on, the image of his freedom, however distant, burning fiercely in his mind. A structure, stark and incongruous against the backdrop of ancient woods. It was a single, squat building made of weathered concrete, flanked by a rusted metal gate that hung crookedly on broken hinges. A sign, faded and pockmarked by time, leaned precariously near the gate, its peeling paint barely legible: border checkpoint. A wave of relief, sharp and potent, washed over him, almost bringing him to tears. He'd made it. He'd actually made it. He pressed the accelerator, the truck lurching forward, eager to breach the barrier. As he drew closer, however, the initial surge of hope began to curdle. the checkpoint was eerily silent. No guard booth, no lights, no sign of life. Just the concrete shell, the twisted gate, and an overwhelming sense of abandonment. He stopped the truck before the gate, the engine dying with a final, shuddering cough. He stepped out, the gravel crunching loudly under his boots. As his fingers brushed against the rust, a sensation like static electricity shot through him, followed by a dizzying lurch in his perception. The world shimmered. The rusted sign twisted, the words on it shifting, becoming symbols he couldn't comprehend, jagged lines, circles, and shapes that evoked ancient carvings. Then, the true horror began. A low hum vibrated through the ground, rising into a mournful wail that seemed to emanate from the very roots of the trees around him. The air grew heavy, pressing in, stealing his breath. From the depths of the shimmering checkpoint, a form began to coalesce. It was a hunger made manifest, a profound emptiness that pulsed with malevolent awareness. Images flooded Reid's mind, unbidden and brutal. He sought his distant relative, not as he remembered him, frail and bewildered, but as a younger man, desperate and terrified, standing before a crude altar of stones, offering something precious. He saw generations before that, faces contorted in fear, hands outstretched in supplication, a constant stream of sorrow and sacrifice. He saw the land itself, scarred and desecrated, the ancient burial ground disturbed, its slumbering guardians roused to fury. The entity, or rather, the presence, communicated not with words, but with raw, visceral understanding. It was the spirit of the violated land, the hungry maw awakened by his ancestors' greed, their pacted desperate bargain struck to placate a force they could not comprehend. They had built the cabin, not just as a home, but as a beacon, a tether for the entity, anchoring it to their bloodline. And in return for what meager prosperity they received, they had promised a tribute. Not just of land, or possessions, but of life. A slow, steady draining of vitality, culminating in a final, complete consumption. His distant relative's mysterious death wasn't mysterious at all, it was a failed, incomplete offering. The entity had merely begun to feed. And now, it sought its true heir, the next link in the chain. Reid. The specific demands slammed into his consciousness with the force of a physical blow. It wanted everything. His life, yes, but not a quick, clean end. It wanted his memories, his hopes, his very essence, to be slowly, meticulously devoured, adding to its own ancient, malevolent being. It was a guardian, but a monstrous one, guarding its ancient territory and its claim on his bloodline with an insatiable hunger. The pact demanded a complete surrender, a willing sacrifice of mind, body, and soul, to appease its ancient rage and maintain the twisted balance his ancestors had forged. The border checkpoint dissolved back into its mundane, decrepit form, but the knowledge remained, searing itself into Reid's mind. He stumbled backward, away from the gate, away from the concrete shell that had momentarily become a window into hell. The air still carried that metallic tang, but now it tasted like ash and despair. There was no escape. Not by driving away. The forest was a cage, yes, but the bars were not just trees. They were woven from generations of blood and fear, anchored by a pact that demanded everything from him. The only way out, the only way to appease or defeat it, was through a sacrifice. His own. Or something far, far worse. He looked back at the checkpoint, then at the endless, watchful trees. He knew his enemy now. And the fight, he realized, was only just beginning. The border checkpoint was eerily still. Reid's foot had already pressed the accelerator, the truck lurching forward, but the scene ahead made him recoil. The concrete barrier, chipped and stained, stretched across the narrow road, unremarkable in itself. What chilled him were the figures standing beside it. Two uniformed guards, their backs to him, faced the dense wall of pines on the other side. They were utterly motionless, like mannequins posed for an abandoned diorama. No wind stirred their clothes, no breath plumed from their mouths in the frigid air. A prickle crawled up Reid's spine. He slowed, his tires crunching on loose gravel. He honked, a sharp, hopeful blare that shattered the unnatural quiet. The sound seemed to dissipate into the heavy air, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. The guards didn't stir. He honked again, longer this time, a desperate plea. Still, nothing. He leaned out the window, a nervous tremor in his hands. "Hello," he called, his voice thin against the vast, indifferent woods. A sense of wrongness, more profound than anything he'd felt even in the cabin, began to seep into his bones. He put the truck in park, his gaze fixed on the two unmoving forms. Their uniforms, he noticed now, were faded, their caps askew, as if they'd been standing there for decades. He took a hesitant step onto the gravel, his boots sinking slightly. The air grew heavier, pressing in on him, making his ears ache. He squinted at the barrier, then at the forest beyond it. The road itself, beyond the barrier, seemed to blur, its edges indistinct, as if the forest was slowly reclaiming it. Then, he saw it. A faint, almost transparent sheen, like a film of oil on water, stretched between the two guards, from the barrier to the encroaching trees. It pulsed with a barely visible, sickly green light, a respiration without breath. It was a membrane, not a physical wall, but something far more insidious. It was a trap. The entity wasn't confined to the cabin. It wasn't even confined to the forest. It was tied to him, to his lineage, to the pact that coursed in his very blood. This barrier, this illusion, was merely an extension of its reach, a final, cruel demonstration that there was no escape. The malevolent presence had allowed him to believe he could leave, only to yank the rug from under him at the very precipice of freedom. He wasn't driving away from it, he was merely moving within its larger, invisible cage. The cabin wasn't just a dwelling, it was the anchor, the nexus of its power, and he was being drawn back to it like a moth to a flame. He stumbled back into the truck, the metallic tang in the air suddenly overwhelming, tasting of old iron and something rotten. His breath hitched, a desperate sob catching in his throat. He couldn't outrun it. He couldn't drive through it. The only way out, the only possible chance, was to go back. To confront it. With a shuddering sigh, Reid turned the truck around. The cabin, when it finally loomed into view through the thinning pines, was not merely waiting, it was glowing with an internal, malevolent energy, a faint, pulsing red light emanating from its windows. Stepping out, he clutched the weathered, leather-bound journal he'd found hidden in the floorboards, the true journal, not the decoy, the one that detailed the horrific terms of the generations-old agreement. Its pages, brittle and yellowed, rustled in his trembling hand. It was a ritual of reversal, a blood offering to reclaim what was lost, to sever the parasitic bond. The cabin door, previously a stubborn barrier, now stood ajar, beckoning him. A guttural hum vibrated from within, a sound that seemed to resonate not in his ears, but in his very bones. The floorboards groaned beneath his feet, not with the natural creaks of an old house, but with a deliberate, almost organic sound, as if the wood itself was alive and in agony. The living room was the epicenter. The fireplace, once a source of warmth, now pulsed with that same sickly red light, not fire, but a deeper, more primal glow that throbbed like a monstrous heart. The furniture was overturned, splintered, as if a violent storm had raged indoors, yet no dust or debris littered the floor. It was a pristine destruction, a staged chaos. "You cannot undo what is done. You are ours." He would not yield. He walked towards the pulsing fireplace, each step a deliberate act of defiance against the growing pressure that threatened to crush him. It was the crushing weight of generations of forgotten suffering, of stolen vitality, of a pact made in desperation and paid in blood. He knelt before the hearth, its red light bathing him in an infernal glow. The symbols in the journal, once mere ink on paper, now seemed to glow faintly in his vision. He focused on the intricate sigils, tracing them in his mind, feeling the raw, terrible power they held. As he spoke, the cabin responded. The walls vibrated violently, plaster dust raining down. The windows rattled, not from wind, but from an internal force. A shriek, piercing and inhuman, tore through the air, seeming to emanate from the very fabric of the house. The red light intensified, flaring, threatening to consume him. He tasted copper in his mouth, the metallic tang from outside now an internal reality. He was breaking something, and the entity was fighting back with all the terrible power it had amassed over centuries. He had to finish. He had to. Reid gripped the journal, his knuckles white. He would not yield. He could feel its presence now, vast and formless, yet undeniably there, swirling around him, a suffocating shroud of malice. He stood before the hearth, the air shimmering with an unnatural heat, the light within the stones throbbing like a diseased heart. The pressure intensified, clawing at his mind, trying to pry open the fragile seams of his sanity. But he held firm. He raised the leather-bound journal, its pages brittle beneath his thumb, its cover warm from the fireplace's glow. He didn't know what he was doing, not truly. There was no instruction, no ancient ritual etched within the book's faded script for this. Only the weight of generations, the unspoken burden of a pact. He opened the journal to the last entry, the one he hadn't fully comprehended, a jumble of half-finished thoughts and desperate warnings. He didn't read the words aloud, not exactly. He poured his will into them, into the intent behind them, into the desperate hope that something asterisk in this cursed record held the key. He envisioned the words as anchors, as counterweights to the monstrous force before him. A shriek, not of sound but of pure, vibrating agony, tore through the air, rattling the very foundations of the cabin. The pulsing light flared, blinding white, then contracted violently. Reid felt a sudden, sharp pain, a searing heat that lanced through his hand, through the journal itself. The leather began to smoke, the pages curling and blackening at the edges, not from fire, but from an internal decay. The ink on the page before him blurred, then ran, twisting into indecipherable patterns before dissolving into fine ash. A specific face, the face of the distant relative whose death had brought him here, flickered, then blurred. The journal disintegrated in his grasp, turning to dust that sifted through his fingers, leaving only the faint scent of burnt paper and something acrid, metallic. The pulsing light in the fireplace died. Abruptly. Completely. The pressure that had threatened to crush him simply evaporated. Reid stumbled back, gasping, his knees buckling. He fell to the floor, the rough planks scraping his palms. His head throbbed, a dull ache behind his eyes. The cabin was silent. Utterly, unnervingly silent. The usual creaks and groans of the old wood were gone. The wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Even the frantic thrumming of his own pulse felt muted, distant. He pushed himself up, leaning heavily against the rough-hewn mantelpiece. His hand, where the journal had burned away, felt strangely numb, though there was no visible injury. Just a lingering ghost of heat, a phantom ache. He stared at the fireplace. It was just a fireplace now. Nothing more. The silence was wrong. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty house. It was a vacuum, an absence so profound it felt like a presence in itself. Nothing. A blank. He had traded a piece of himself, a piece of his history, for this unnerving stillness. The horror was gone, perhaps, but it had taken something precious with it, leaving a scar on his very being. He spent the next few hours in a daze, moving through the cabin like a sleepwalker. The air felt thin, sterile, as if all life, all warmth, had been leached from the wood and stone. The cabin felt empty. But not empty in a comforting way. Empty like a tomb, a shell from which something vital had been ripped. He knew he couldn't stay. Not here. Not anymore. He packed a single bag, his movements stiff and mechanical. He didn't look back as he stepped out of the cabin, the heavy door closing with a soft, final thud behind him. The forest, usually so dense and watchful, now felt merely indifferent, its canopy a uniform green against a pale sky. He drove, the old truck rumbling beneath him, 4 hours, the sun a distant, uninterested observer. The world outside the forest felt alien, too bright, too loud. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, the phantom heat still lingering in his palm. He tried to push away the encroaching fog in his mind, the gaping hole where memories used to be. Eventually, the crude asphalt of the forest road gave way to a paved highway, and then, stark against the flat, featureless landscape, appeared the low, functional buildings of a border checkpoint. A barrier, painted with faded yellow and black stripes, hung across the road. 2 uniformed officers stood beside a small booth, their expressions bored, their movements languid in the afternoon heat. Reid slowed the truck, his heart thudding a slow, uneven rhythm in his chest. He felt a sudden, irrational panic. What if they could see it? The emptiness, the scar on his mind? What if the horror had merely receded, only to cling to him, a silent, invisible passenger? He rolled down the window, the rush of the outside world suddenly overwhelming. The scent of exhaust fumes, the distant drone of traffic, the harsh sunlight reflecting off the officer's sunglasses, it all felt too real, too sharp. One of the officers, a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard, approached his window. "Afternoon, sir." He met the officer's gaze, but his own eyes felt distant, unfocused. He wondered if the horror was truly gone, or if it had merely found a new, more insidious way to follow him. Reid fumbled for his wallet, his fingers clumsy, his mind still adrift in the chilling silence of the cabin. The air outside felt thin, sharp, and too clean after the suffocating density within the ancient walls. He was out, physically. His body, bruised and exhausted, registered the bite of the late autumn wind. The officer, a stoic presence, guided him towards a waiting vehicle, his movements deliberate, his questions few. Reid offered only fragments, disjointed words about an inheritance, an old place, strange occurrences. He kept the truth, the raw, visceral truth of the entity and the generations-old pact, locked behind a numb, aching wall in his skull. It was a secret too vast, too monstrous, to ever articulate. Reid stared out the window, the landscape a meaningless tapestry. He saw not the familiar greens and browns of the forest, but the spectral tendrils that had woven themselves into the cabin's very fabric, the faces of those who had come before him, trapped in their own desperate bargains. The lineage of sacrifice, the debt that had accrued, generation after generation, until it had fallen upon him. He had broken it, he thought. He had severed the connection, at least for now. Hours later, the vehicle slowed, pulling into a line of cars under a stark, functional canopy. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sickly yellow glow on the asphalt. This was the border checkpoint. A place of transition, a gateway back to a world that felt utterly alien. His face was impassive, his eyes scanning. "Passports, please," he requested, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. Reid watched the officer beside him present his credentials, then fumbled for his own. His fingers, still trembling almost imperceptibly, found the familiar blue booklet. He handed it over, the smooth, cool plastic cover feeling impossibly mundane against the landscape of his recent memory. The agent's gaze lingered on Reid for a moment longer than necessary. He wondered if the agent could sense the tremor of the earth beneath them, the distant echo of a bargain paid in blood. But the agent merely grunted, stamped the passport, and handed it back. "Welcome back," he said, his voice a practiced neutrality. The words, "welcome back," tasted like ash. Back to what? The barrier lifted with a metallic groan, and the vehicle lurched forward. Reid leaned his head against the cool glass of the window, watching the border checkpoint recede in the rearview mirror. He was across. He was free. But the freedom was a cage of its own making. He could still feel it, a subtle pressure just behind his eyes, a faint, metallic tang on his tongue that wasn't quite real, yet utterly present. The entity, he realized, hadn't merely been confined to the cabin. It had seeped into him, into the very fabric of his understanding. He was a vessel now, not for its power, but for its memory, its truth. The world outside the cabin was no longer a safe haven, but a stage upon which the horror might yet play out its next act, only this time, the stage was within him. He was a survivor, yes, but he was also a carrier, forever marked by the indelible stain of the ancient pact. And sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are the ones you carry within.